it has devolved into a cult. Primary voters in the Republican Party have devolved into a Trumpist cult.
It's not a good place for any party to end up with a cult-like situation as it relates to a president that happens to be purportedly of the same parties.
Wow, you could hear you, Joe, at I think it was 6:05 in the morning yesterday, and then Bob Corker a couple hours later. I heard the word used throughout the day yesterday that Trump is a cult-like figure. This was Senator Bob Corker yesterday talking about the GOP's radio silence on President Trump. Welcome back to Morning Joe. It's Thursday, June 14th. Still with us, we have MSNBC contributor Mike Barnacle, former aide to the George W. Bush White House and State Department's Elise Jordan, chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude, Jr. Good to have you all on board this hour. Joe, I feel like the conversation is changing direction a bit, where we're asking less and trying to discern more about where we're headed, given the troubling presidency that we're dealing with.
Well, I actually think that Mark Sanford's defeat in South Carolina 1 was a defining moment for the Republican Party. I say that because Mark was a conservative's conservative for years. Got through a scandal that the Republican voters were perfectly fine with, but couldn't get past saying one or two bad things about Donald Trump. Listen, this guy has a lifetime 93% rating from Club for Growth, 92% lifetime average from Heritage Action, and a 91% American Conservative Union lifetime average. And somehow he was insufficiently Trumpist to win his own primary. Let's bring in right now still the congressman for South Carolina 1, but a recently liberated man, Mark Sanford. Mark, it's always great to see you. Let me first of all, let me just ask you to give us your reflections on what happened the past couple days and during the campaign.
Well, short and simple as I got beat, but I think the themes that come from it have implications, as you suggest, for a whole lot of other races out there, and sort of our belief in institutions in this country, and what the Republican Party is ultimately about. So I guess I'd say, in shortest form, we, swear allegiance to the Constitution, and we pledge allegiance to the flag. And what was weird about this race that I've never experienced before in any race that I've been a part of was an allegiance question, where people say, are you for or against the president? I'd give sort of a nuanced answer. I'm with them most of the time, but I've disagreed on a couple of issues when they've been inconsistent with the promises that I made in running, or my belief in terms of conservative philosophy, or the very people that I represent. If you look at my rating, I've basically voted with them 89% of the time, disagreed with them a handful of times. And yet the answer would be, no, I want to know, are you for or against the president? And again, I'd say, look, I love my brothers and sisters, but I'm not with them all the time. I agree that I've never before had a question of allegiance to a person rather than allegiance to the flag and the Constitution. And to a degree, that's what this race came down to.
Well, and that's what's so frightening, is that it really is, it seems like a personality cult, where you have to have, you don't pledge an oath to the Constitution of the United States. You don't pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. It goes directly to Donald Trump. I've known you for a quarter. I know the first time I met you, you got all the incoming freshmen in, and you had a chart, and you showed us the challenges facing us on the federal deficit, the federal debt, entitlement spending. You basically predicted where we were going. And I would like to say, when people say that I'm a squish or I've changed this way, I'd love to say, yes, I'm actually nuanced enough to do that. But like me, you've been saying the same thing about trade, about deficits, about debt, about entitlement spending for a quarter of a century. You've been saying the same exact thing, more so than anybody else I came into Congress with in 1994. How does it change? Like people that have known you for a quarter of a century and heard you saying, I'm for free trade, I'm for balancing the budget, let's not spend so much money, let's reform entitlements, let's save Social Security. What do they say when they look into your eye? You know, you're saying the same exact thing you've been saying for over 2 decades now.
Well, that's the puzzle of, again, this race, and something that I'm trying to figure out myself. But what I'd say is those traditional merit badges, if you will, did not matter in this race. And obviously, actually, it was a close race. It was a very divided race. I mean, it was separated by about 3,000 votes. But at the end of the day, for the people that voted against me, those things, those traditional markers of conservative philosophy, market principle, and constitutional rule of the American system, those merit badges didn't matter. And that is, again, something that I think has alarming consequences for races that go well beyond the 1st District of South Carolina.
Congressman, it's Willie Geist. It's good to see you. As you mentioned, the race was tight. Do you believe the president's late tweet in which he criticized you and said you have not been helpful to the MAGA agenda, as he put it, and also raised your 2009 story in Argentina, do you believe that cost you the election?
Well, I think it's the larger climate of Trump versus not that cost me the election. I think that probably prevented me from going into a runoff. I mean, a couple hundred votes would have put us in a runoff.
Right.
But I think that there are a couple interesting things about that tweet. One, when's the last time a Republican president got into a congressional race, particularly if you're supposedly negotiating a deal in the Far East? I mean, so his degree of focus on personal things, if you offend me, I'm coming back to get you, is again, a little bit outside the norm, to say the least. But more interesting is, it wasn't the truth. It was just a flat-out lie. That's why Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan and people like that have risen to my defense to say, wait a minute, this guy voted for all of the president's agenda, yet he sends a tweet out saying, you're not supportive of my agenda.
So what do you suggest now, then, as we come up on the fall, to candidates running for re-election? Because on the one hand, you want to keep your job to continue to push in Washington the conservative ideals and the policies you believe in. On the other hand, it appears that crossing Donald Trump in any way, as you point out, you've been supportive of him but crossed him a couple of times, could cost you that seat. So what's your political advice to Republicans running this fall about how to handle Donald Trump?
The politics are easy. Pledge allegiance to Donald Trump. But I think that's a mistake at a soul level. It was interesting in my concession speech the other night. Had my 4 boys with me, and it was a profoundly moving moment when afterward they hugged me and they said, Dad, we're proud of you. And so I think we all got to sort of look inside of each one of our souls and say, where am I in this? You know, there are always trade-offs in politics, and we got to recognize that's the tug of war of policy versus, district, and go down the list. But I think everybody's got to answer that question for themselves, and I would wish them well. But I would say I've been amazed at the number of different members who've come up to me over the last 24 hours since I've been back here on the Hill and have talked about a tribalism component to what's going on in the party and with the Trump effect that worries them and that they've never seen before.
So, Congressman, following up on the thread of that conversation, yesterday we had former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson here, who expressed real regret at your loss. Just listen to what he said yesterday.
I am, these days, a little depressed about, frankly, the state of our politics.
Yeah.
We have a president who denigrates the institutions of his own government, which I simply cannot get my head around. And then when we look at the primary results last night from South Carolina, Mark Sanford, who in my experience is a very thoughtful member of Congress. He was on the House Homeland Security Committee. He would sit through the entire hearing. He was the most junior member, so he'd be last. But he'd always ask the most intelligent, insightful question, and it wasn't a knee-jerk question requiring a knee-jerk response. And so it's depressing to me to see a thoughtful member of Congress like that lose re-election.
And so this morning, maybe you can help us out here, because there seems to be a growing divergence in defining the difference between Trumpism and conservatism. And this morning also, on the front page of the New York Times, there is a picture of a young 2-year-old child being separated from her mother at the border. From Honduras, she is being separated from her mother in tears at the border. And as a conservative, as an American, as someone who respects the borders and wants border security, help us out here. How would a conservative look at this issue and other issues as compared to Trumpism looking at this issue and other issues? What is a conservative today?
Conservative is what a conservative has always been, which is one who has a rightful and legitimate suspicion of government's growth, one who believes in what Jefferson talked about, wherein there's a dividing line with government on one side and at times liberty on the other, and there's a healthy tension between those two, and oftentimes in as much one side grows, the other side shrinks. So, I mean, I could go through the traditional components of conservatism, but I go back to what I keep hearing since I've been back here on the Hill since my defeat, which is a lot of talk about, well, that's not what we have right now. We have a form of tribalism, and we have a breach of, you know, one of the great components of the institutional setup of the Founding Fathers, which is they divided legitimately power across the executive, legislative, and judicial branch so that we would be checks upon the other and that there would be indeed vigorous debate. And this idea that if you challenge somebody and say, look, I hear where you're coming from, but the folks back home are saying something different and therefore I got to go a different way, and here's the reasons for doing so, if that becomes something that's unacceptable in the course of American politics, we got a real problem, because that's exactly what the Founding Fathers set up, which is a healthy tension wherein there was to be debate, there was to be dissent, well, not pledges of allegiance, if you want to call them that.
I do think we have a real problem. I think we need to come to terms with that. Elise.
Congressman, you wrote an op-ed saying that Donald Trump should release his tax returns, and that the lack of knowledge surrounding Donald Trump's personal financial interest has continued to plague this administration, and to the point of we don't know if our foreign policy is being decided by Trump or Kushner family interest. Are you still going to push for the release of the tax returns?
I made my point clear on that. It isn't going anywhere, but I made my point clear because it's a 50-year tradition that has served this country very, very well, wherein every president, Republican or Democrat, has done so. But more importantly, and this is as a former governor, I released my tax returns twice as I became the nominee for my party back home. There was a value to the taxpayer in doing that. People could look, it was another data point where they could say, why is he doing this, or where's this coming from? It cleared up gray area, it cleared up question. And if you don't have a president releasing their tax return, make certain that, believe me, governors across this country, gubernatorial candidates across this country won't be releasing theirs. So I think it's something that has effect well beyond the president's returns, but really to the larger tradition that's been adhered to for more than 50 years in this country.
All right, conservative champion and steadfast warrior for conservative causes for over a quarter of a century, Mark Sanford, thank you so much for being with us. We're grateful for you coming on the show, and we hope to see you again sometime soon.
I appreciate it, Joe. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for being on.
All right. You know, Mika, there's just so much here that's it's just astounding. Again, we've talked about the Republican Party and where the Republican Party's gone with the defeat of Mark Sanford, a man who was actually endorsed by the Freedom Caucus, who was endorsed by Jim Jordan, who was endorsed by Mark Meadows, who was endorsed by anybody, Paul Ryan, endorsed by anyone who believes like Mark Sanford has believed for a quarter of a century in smaller government. in less regulations, in entitlement reform, in saving future generations from massive, overwhelming debt. For anybody who believes in that, Mark Sanford was their candidate. But for those who didn't vote for Mark Sanford, it is an example of where the Republican Party's gone, and that it is a personality cult. Yeah. And, you know, Eddie, that may feel good in the moment for Republicans in South Carolina one that says, the hell with conservative principles. The hell with our lifelong belief in small government. The hell with everything that we and our party have held dear for decades. We're now going to completely put our conscience and our ideology in a blind trust for Donald Trump. That may feel good today for him, I guess. But boy, a hard rain's going to fall come November in places like Virginia and across the country where they're electing these extremists that pledge allegiance to Donald Trump but know nothing about being conservative.
Well, Joe, I think you're right. And you know, as a religious studies scholar, I'm going to put my PhD hat on now. And you know, we got to be careful with our use of the word cult, right? Because it doesn't really have kind of the analytical clarity for us that we might want it to do. But I understand what we're registering. I just wanted to say that for my scholars out there.
There you go.
Amen.
But I want to ask you this question, though, Joe. It's common political sense that when Republicans run in their primaries, that they have to run right. They have to play to their base. Mm-hmm. And in playing to their base, they knew that they could not, when it came to the general election, make the same claims, that they would have to run back in some ways to the center. What is happening to that logic? Is it the case that the base that they had to appeal to in the primary has now metastasized and become the party itself? So what I'm trying to say is that, are we thinking about Trumpism as something distinct and unique from what was happening among Republicans throughout their primaries, or is there some relationship between the two? Because I'm trying to think about Trumpism as being a part of the Republican Party, that it reflects Buchananism. It reflects what Republicans had to do in terms of appealing to their base in their primary. So I'm trying to understand how we describe Trumpism in this moment. Does that make sense?
It does, and there are two ways to look at it. You could first of all look at it just in terms of what's going on today, and you could look at the changes in the Republican Party, that there has been a dark underside to the Republican Party and conservatism, which has usually been checked by whether it's John McCain or Mitt Romney or George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush or Ronald Reagan. That dark underbelly it has usually been checked by the leader of the party. Jeb Bush, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush would always talk about, would always push back and let Republicans know that actually reaching out to voters in groups that they weren't comfortable with, like Hispanic voters, was extraordinarily important. George W. Bush wasn't calling Hispanics breeders. He was going there campaigning hard. He got 44% of the vote of Hispanic voters in 2004. Donald Trump is playing to the lowest common denominator, and I think that's one part of the story. And so, yes, we have seen the ugliest side of Republicanism metastasize, and it now has become all about Donald Trump and his collection of prejudices and resentments. There's another part of it, though. And sadly, I don't think that this is just in the Republican Party. I think it's in the Democratic Party as well. Tribalism. Just pure, unadulterated tribalism where people in a party line up before their leader no matter what. I could get you quotes from top Democratic leaders when the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke out, saying that if this is true, then Bill Clinton needs to resign. Patrick Moynihan, I believe, said that. Well, it became true. And you had and Maureen Dowd has written about this often. You had a lot of women that knew better lining up to attack Monica Lewinsky and defend Bill Clinton because power was preeminent. They had a seat at the table. They had a president who supported the things that they supported. He even supported partial birth abortions. He was their man. He would go to the wall for them on policy, so his personal life didn't really matter. We all know that the chickens came home to roost, right? Read Maureen Dowd's column this past week. Read Maureen Dowd's column during the campaign, and we saw there was a payment that became due ultimately for not only the Clintons, but the Democrats and the women who blindly followed Bill Clinton when they should have spoken out. I am certain, Mika, that the same thing is going to happen to these Republicans who are blindly following Donald Trump, but I guarantee you it will not take 16 years for this bill to come due. This bill will come due much more quickly, and the price paid by these sycophants will be much greater politically. They will be swept from power, and it may be a very long time before there is another Republican sitting in the White House.
Willie, my mother called me yesterday and just said they're wrecking the country. They're just wrecking everything, and she was despondent.
Well, to underline Joe's point, you just had Mark Sanford, one of the leading lights of the conservative movement for a quarter century now. When asked what he would say to Republicans running for Congress, he said the politics are simple. Pledge allegiance to Donald Trump.
No.
That's where the party is right now. And if you don't believe it, read the tweet last night from Ronna McDaniel, the chairwoman of the Republican Party, in which she writes, anyone that does not embrace the real Donald Trump agenda of making America great again will be making a mistake. This is about a man, not a party or ideas.
Still ahead on Morning Joe, two people who know a lot about Michael Cohen's ties to the Russia investigation. Member of the House Intel Committee, Jim Himes, and Vanity Fair reporter Emily Jane Fox, who's broken several scoops. They join us next on Morning Joe. Bring in senior reporter at Vanity Fair and an NBC News and MSNBC contributor, Emily Jane Fox. Emily's out with a new piece entitled, I Feel Like Don Quixote. Michael Cohen's legal shakeup foretells a possible battle with Trump. And on Capitol Hill, member of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. Let's get the update on Michael Cohen, Emily. Everyone keeps asking if he's going to flip. Why wouldn't he? And what's the timeline on this?
Well, Michael Cohen is certainly in a place of leverage right now. He feels like he has not been protected by the president's family, and by his inner circle in Washington. And this is a man who's been around for more than a decade and seen a lot of things and done a lot of things. And so he has not been supported. His legal situation is mounting and getting more and more serious. And so he's in a position where right now the case is changing from document review to what happens after that. There's no sense of timeline. He, according to people around him, has not yet sat down with prosecutors. He has not yet made a final determination. In fact, he is switching attorneys come tomorrow, and he does not yet have a new attorney. So there are several steps that need to take place in order for whatever happens next to actually come to fruition. But it is entering a whole new sphere of this legal.
We've been in the middle of this will he, won't he cooperate game. It feels like for months now. I guess the question is, what's the holdup? What's he considering? What on the side of the ledger exists even that says I wouldn't cooperate at this point? And has he been approached, do we know at all, by the Southern District for a deal? Because our reporting is that they haven't come to him yet.
The holdup is that they have not come to him. Right. According to people around him, he has not yet been approached, and I think that is the major holdup right now.
Do you have any sense, Emily, of his sources of income right now?
I don't know that there's income flowing in right now. His primary job for the last at least 2 months has been sorting through these 3.7 million documents. That has been taking up to 10 hours a day of his time, and there are not a lot of clients who have wanted to work with him. his general feeling right now, besides his feeling of betrayal from the Trump camp, is that his life has been collateral damage in order to get to the president. So his business has been destroyed, his family has been destroyed. He is a pawn in this game, and so he is just waiting for a next phase.
Congressman Himes, your view right now of Michael Cohen and where he fits into this investigation. How crucial is he?
Well, as the president's fixer, you have to assume that that he's got stuff that could make the president look pretty bad, and it may have nothing to do with Russian collusion. It may or it may not. You know, there are questions about all these trips that Michael Cohen took or didn't take, and presumably we'll get some answers around that. But of course, just, you know, some of the practices that we hear that the president regularly used as a developer in New York, those are now going to be there for everyone to see. This could be that blue dress moment, by which I mean, of course, when an investigation takes a turn, as it did under Bill Clinton, that nobody necessarily would have predicted. But look, the dynamic here is not one of getting support from the White House. If that's where we're going, remember, this is an investigation. It's being done by the Southern District of New York. They're going through huge numbers of documents. And remember, there was the whole process to determine whether some of those documents were subject to attorney-client privilege. This is an investigation. And when you say support from the White House, it makes me really nervous, because it harkens back to where we were a couple of weeks ago when the president was willy-nilly, without any of the traditional mechanisms, issuing pardons. And so that's part of the dynamic here, too. You know, I think a guy like Michael Cohen or Paul Manafort is thinking in the back of their heads, maybe there's a pardon for me, too, which would be obviously a huge miscarriage of justice.
Hey, Congressman, this morning on the front page of the New York Times, I don't know whether you saw it or noticed it, but there's a picture of a 2-year-old girl from Honduras. She and her mother stopped at the border. The mother's being frisked. The child is in tears. This story and others about children continue on a day-to-day basis. They are overwhelmed, of course, by the constant stories about Donald Trump and the special prosecutor. But we now, the United States of America, hold thousands of children in what are called detention centers along the border. Your thoughts?
Well, every American, regardless of party affiliation or what they feel about Donald Trump, needs to understand that in a democracy, that is being done in their name. And this is not a Democratic or a Republican thing. You know, the American Conference of Bishops, the senior hierarchy of the Catholic Church, came out very strongly opposed to something that shouldn't take the bishops to oppose, which is that it is just plain wrong, regardless of circumstances, to take children away from their mothers and fathers. And that is what is being done in their name. And look, you know, the White House hasn't been at all, and the Attorney General hasn't been at all shy about explaining that. Their explanation is, well, that's what's going to happen, so be afraid, be very afraid if you try to come to this country. That is not the way that I think most Americans would have their country, their exceptional and great country, behave in their name.
So a couple of weeks ago, Senator Merkley from Oregon was turned away at one of the detention centers along the border in Texas. He was refused admittance, where again children are being held against their will, separated from their parents. Why is it that members of Congress and members of the United States Senate, I know you can't speak for them, haven't gone down by the busloads and demanded entrance to these detention centers to inspect the conditions under which children, having already been orphaned by the federal government, are living?
Well, a bunch have, and there have been some tours. It has, interestingly enough, because this shouldn't be a partisan issue, this is a moral and ethical issue, it has been largely Democrats. And where I would point to on that is, who in this building has subpoena power? Who could actually say, no, you are going to show up in front of my committee and explain this policy and show me photographs and talk about the numbers of children? That, of course, would be committee chairmen in the House and the Senate, all of whom are Republicans. And so, you know, again, if you're of my party, you say this is one of the many urgent reasons why the American public should think hard about how they vote in November. Because right now, for all the reasons that you've been talking about on the show this morning, there is no constitutional check on the behavior of this administration, including, again, what should not be a Trump or Republican or Democratic thing, but the fact that as we speak, toddlers are being taken from the arms of their mothers and fathers and sent into some so-called detention center away from their families. And regardless of where you are politically, that needs to stop.
So, Congressman, the question is what's being done to stop that then? And there is a compromise Republican bill, as you know, that's been floated out there that would have among its provisions the cessation of what we're seeing on the border right now, that would not have children separated from their parents. What are the chances of that clearing the House? And what are the chances that children will stop being separated from their parents because of action on Capitol Hill soon?
Well, I don't think they're good, sadly. The story of the immigration bill, and this gets a little bit kind of technical into parliamentary stuff, but, you know, the moderate Republicans, such as they are, were going to force a vote on 4 different immigration bills, some of which were very conservative, some of which were actually very sort of moderate in their orientation. They were going to do that through something called a discharge position, which would have taken control of the floor away from Republican leadership. Well, they didn't follow through in the end, and so we're going to see 2 probably very conservative bills, none of which will be, I think, satisfying to people who actually care about immigrants or about the way children are treated. And I would tell you, they are likely to fail. So I fear that 2 weeks from now, we're going to be exactly where we are today without an immigration bill, and looking at people like the chairman of the House Oversight Committee saying, wait a second, look at these photographs, call a hearing, go to one of these detention centers. At a minimum, make sure that these children are being cared for and treated well. At least do that if you don't feel you can stand up to the president and stop this tearing apart of families.
All right, Congressman Jim Himes, as always, thank you so much for being with us. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim.
Let's go back to Emily Jane Fox. Yeah. Emily, I'd like to know whether your reporting has uncovered Michael Cohen's financial situation, because here's a guy that's had tens of millions of dollars reportedly passed through him, or at least passed through his name, but to help Donald Trump pay off Stormy Daniels, he had to take out, had to borrow money from a second mortgage, I think, on his in-laws' home. As we're looking at how much he's being squeezed, is he in the situation now that Rick Gates was in, where he just financially could not afford to take on the feds?
Look, there have been, I believe, 15 lawyers working round the clock, working so many hours that some of them had to sleep in their law offices on couches. These are people who have been going through 3.7 million documents in a very short period of time. It's a very highly skilled New York City law firm. These legal bills are crippling for anybody, no matter how many millions of dollars are passing through. And as we know, none of the clients who had been working with him over the past several years are still working with him. And so it's been a very difficult financial squeeze, and sure, that plays into a decision-making process as well.
Emily Jane Fox, can't wait for your book to come out. We're getting closer, right?
Tuesday, couple of days.
Trump.
It's going to be huge.
Inside America's First Family, and you actually had such inside connection on this story. I've seen a little bit of it. I can't wait to read the whole thing. Yeah. There's no one else who has this story, so we look forward to that. Just good to have you on this morning. This morning, President Trump is waking up to birthday wishes from Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin spokesperson says the Russian leader sent a congratulatory telegram this morning. And our producers put together this birthday greeting for the president, which we think he might like.
Happy birthday to me. Well, happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to Donald J. Trump. They're singing happy birthday to me. Oh, happy birthday. Hey, I'm president. Can you believe it, right?
We have thousands of people that have asked for that. Thousands and thousands of people. So many people asked when I was on the campaign. I'd say, wait a minute, I don't have any relationship. But they said, when you can, President, we'd love our son to be brought back home. You know, the remains. And I asked, we had pretty much finished, and I said, would you do me a favor? The remains of these great fallen heroes, could we do something? He agreed to it immediately. It's pretty great.
President Trump saying the parents of fallen career war veterans asked him to help arrange the return of their sons from...
Joe,
this is awkward.
We've been doing some back-of-the-envelope math here.
Per the VA, the average age of Korean War veterans is estimated at 87 years old, meaning those parents, if still alive, would be well over 100. I mean, I can't. It's hard to really read this stuff with a straight face. It is clear the president is stunningly ignorant. Probably the most ignorant president we will ever have.
No, come on, Mika. That's not, Mika. That's just not fair. He's not ignorant. He's not ignorant. He's actually lying. Willie, I'm not really good at math.
I think everybody gives him way too much credit. The guy is ignorant.
I'm not too good at math, Willie. But thank you, Mika. Thank you.
Well, you know, we just need to stop asking questions about what the strategy is and what could he really be doing.
Yeah.
He's ignorant. He's warped. He's obsessed with money and sex. And he finds his power through those two things. And that is the strategy of this president. It's pretty base and caveman-like. And I'm not going to pretend to dance around questions to be objective, when clearly the only people who have loyalty oaths to him are those who are afraid and will lose their jobs if they don't follow him blindly. But there's right and there's wrong, and everyone knows the difference. Let's stop playing games. There's no question here.
Hey, Willie.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Can you tell me? A weird thing just happened. I had the feed from our show, and suddenly Kate McKinnon from SNL came up, and I was just curious, how did Alex do that? Got her in a split box, the whole thing. No, you know, it's not that Donald Trump is ignorant. It's not that Donald Trump is anything else, but he's lying. There's no way that 110-year-old parents came up to him.
Donald Trump is ignorant.
There is a third theory.
It's a compliment.
There is a third theory, and that is that he's delusional.
Well, he has his own world.
There's a little
He's living in his own world.
Look, Jeff,
and I think that is that certainly has to be put up there as another explanation.
Joe, Willie and I did the math. Willie's got the math. He's much better at math than I am. But we started with the point of reference that if you are part of a family who lost a son at the Chosin Reservoir with the 5th Marines in 1951, the winter of 1951, well, Willie, do the math on that.
So Chosin was November and December of 1950. Let's say you're a 25-year-old kid, right? Or let's say 20-year-old. You're a young kid.
You're 20.
Okay? So you're born in 1930. Generously, your parents were born in 1905, if they were 25 years old when you were born. 1910, maybe. So during the 2016 campaign, when President Trump says they were approaching him and saying, please bring back the remains of my son, they would have been 106 to 110 years old. But your point, Joe...
They've been waiting a long time.
But yes, they have. Your point, Joe, is right. This isn't ignorance. This is... He's making up a story, just like his friend Jim, who never goes to Paris anymore because it's so dangerous. He sort of makes up this straw man.
Jim never goes to Paris anymore.
He never goes. Make up a story. Hope people don't check out the details to make your point.
Because you're ignorant.
You know, Jim never goes to Paris, actually. You know, Jim never goes to Paris anymore because Jim says Paris isn't Paris anymore, just like those parts of Europe that you can't go into because the police are afraid of it because Muslim gangs and marauders have taken over the area. All right, Mika, we'll go back to you now.
Alex is too scared to let me speak, so I'm giving it to him.
Not at all.
He wants
He's a smart guy.
Republican congressman because Lord knows I might ask a question that garners an answer that will make everybody want to be sick.
Go for it, Mika. Go.
Oh, okay. Joining us now, retired U.S. Marine and member of, I've frightened everyone, a member of the House Armed Services and Homeland Security Committees, Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Do you have any concerns at all about the president's summit and outcome with Kim Jong-un?
Well, I think to the extent that we find ourselves in a protracted negotiation, that redounds to North Korea and China's advantage, because almost by definition it means that we're letting up on the maximum pressure campaign. And in the press conference after the summit, the president seemed to admit that China is breaking sanctions. So if indeed that's the case, I think we should be in the business of applying more pressure. We should be sending letters of inquiry to Chinese banks and businesses that may be engaged in money laundering and supporting the North Korean regime. I also have concerns that we didn't see the words complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement in the agreement. But listen, I think there's a lot of time for Secretary Pompeo to come to the Hill. This is obviously the start of a longer process here. I give the administration a lot of credit for creating the opportunity, and I think we all want to see this process and this crisis resolved peacefully and diplomatically. And we in Congress should be working with the White House, by the way, on a bipartisan basis, to make sure that our diplomacy has the best chance possible to succeed.
I appreciate your honesty. I see that you are a skeptic on the concessions to the Kim regime, and I wonder, does that concern you at all? Are you afraid that President Trump will be mad at you? Because many Republicans appear to be afraid to speak a little bit more candidly about some of the concerns they may have.
Well, listen, I want the president to succeed, and I've seen in the past 8 years, well, really, I think since the 70s, which I'm told were an interesting decade, Congress has surrendered a lot of its authority on national security to the executive branch, and I think that distorts some fundamentals of our Constitution. So I think it's perfectly appropriate for Congress to be an equal partner in this process, and I actually think it enhances the White House's leverage. When they sit across, there's well-established political science literature on the nature of two-level games. In other words, when the White House sits across the table from their North Korean counterparts, they can point to Congress and say, hey, we got these crazy men and women in Congress that have to approve any agreement that we get, and that's why we're insisting on such a harsh agreement. So I actually think if you want to see this resolved diplomatically, Congress should insist on a place at the table. And that, by the way, that's also the best way for any deal they get to survive this presidency. As we saw with the Iran deal, it did not outlast the Obama administration.
So, Dr. Sachs, the president said yesterday North Korea, quote, is no longer a nuclear threat. Of course, that's not true one day after the summit. He's obviously talked about stopping or at least suspending military exercises along the border. He even floated yesterday in an interview the idea of getting American troops off the Korean peninsula, saying it costs too much. What's your view, if anything, of what moved the ball forward at that summit? Are we any closer to the denuclearization with North Korea than we were a week ago?
To be honest, I think we just don't know.
Sorry,
I mean, we throw this word denuclearization around, and it's clear that Kim is speaking an entirely different language when he says that word. I mean, when they say denuclearization, and by the way, this is being filtered through the South Korean press that very much wants a deal, oftentimes they're talking about suspension of further advancements of their program, where we're really talking about dismantlement. So I think there's a lot of work left to be done. I think it was neither the historic victory that one side is claiming, nor the historic concession that the other side is claiming. It's sort of bizarre to me that all this is being analyzed through the filter of tribal partisan politics. I think we should all try and take a step back and just figure out what's actually going on here.
All right, Jeffrey Sachs, jump in.
Well, I agree with
Congressman Mike Gallagher, thank you very much for being on.
Thanks, Congressman.
Yeah, I agree with the Congressman that first, nothing decisive happened. Second, this is a long slog. Third, one should have expected nothing different from this. The president likes spectacles. He likes the daily publicity, but this was not the breakthrough that he claims, but much better than nuclear war. So I'm glad that this happened. I don't think anything decisive happened, but it's a much better situation than the awful situation of last year of yelling at each other and up to the brink. But there's so much delusion and illusion, and the president likes the daily spectacle, but that's quite different from long-term policy.
Jeffrey, the statement itself was like 329 words or whatever. I mean, the lack of specificity. What bothers you the most about the lack of specificity?
Well, what bothers me in general is the complete improvisation of our foreign policy day to day. So it's not only this, we're in a complete frenzy in all aspects of foreign policy. Of course, breaking with our closest allies, changes of mood hour to hour. Nobody can rely on what the president says for 1 minute, because if someone says something else and it triggers his emotional impulsivity, then he's going to reverse the next moment. So we're in a lot of instability because of a personal quirk, that's putting it mildly, of the president. So we don't have systematic foreign policy right now. And for a while it worked. I think the Korean thing, I mean, it didn't work, but the summit just now kind of exposed this doesn't really produce anything. And so I think this was kind of the peak of that kind of foreign policy by impulse and spectacle. But we're stuck with a lot of instability right now because nobody does serious work.
No, and that will last decades. Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, thank you very much. Still ahead, MSNBC's Jacob Sovoroff joins us live after his rare look inside the Trump administration's detention center for migrant children. It's supposed to be a shelter, but Jacob says that kids are effectively incarcerated. Morning Joe is coming right back.